So today on the Golden Mean, I have a really good friend. She's a really good friend. She's a colleague. And I think that she's sort of one of those people who has the institutional memory of the city I'm from and that I love, Chicago. Carolyn Grisko is the president and CEO of Grisko LLC, a public affairs, public relations, digital and marketing communications company in Chicago in its 25th year. So she was one of the trailblazers in Chicago, especially in terms of women owning PR firms, launching PR firms. And she's someone I partner with too. So she's a friend, she's a colleague, and she has a really unique perspective on Chicago politics. Talk about that, talk about police accountability, because she's been involved in some of that long before all this stuff we're seeing right now in June of 2020. So let me just, and then we'll get to also leadership and business and some of the lessons she's learned, try to tie it all in here together. Welcome, my friend. Thank you for doing this and taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you, Michael. Happy to do it.
I appreciate it. You know what? First thing I want to add to that bio by telling folks that I think that Carolyn has a really unique view into Chicago politics. And part of the reason is because she managed Mayor Daley's re-election campaign 25 years ago.
1995, actually.
Right. 25 years ago. She also worked with, around the mayor's office when Rahm Emanuel was mayor, but then she was one of the kitchen cabinet and advisors to Lori Lightfoot while she was running for mayor, and she won. And now Carolyn was on that transition team and continues to be in touch and advise and be a sounding board for the mayor. So you can really contrast a couple things here, and let's start with that with Chicago politics. I don't know if you even can, but take me from what it was like during Richard M. Daley, his administration, when Chicago was still really, really a quote machine. A lot of people would say it still is to a certain extent, but how the city and politics, mayor and city hall, have changed over 25 years. Because from Richard Daley to Rahm to Lori Lightfoot, that's quite a traverse.
Yes, it is. And I should say in the Rahm years was not my big involvement with the mayor's office.
That's true.
So I came to the Daley administration first in 95 after a fairly long career in journalism. I was at WBEZ as a political reporter, news director, and then ultimately a program host. So then going into the mayor's communications office was kind of like literally walking through the looking glass. Like 1 week later, you're on the other side, and it was fascinating, and it was definitely an education. And there was a very tight team of people. Avis Lavelle led the communications office, was the press secretary. I was her deputy. People like Frank Cruzy was the policy director, Tim Degnan, head of IGA, Kelly Welsh, Forrest Claypool. So it was a tight team.
You're forgetting one guy.
Which one?
Gary Chico.
Well, Gary came in later. He came in later
after that. That's right. Okay.
So,
and by the way, the reason I bring that up and interrupted Carolyn is he's a mutual friend of ours, Gary Chico. I'm 0-3 with him in campaigns, a Senate and 2 mayorals. So while Carolyn's winning and running around City Hall, but Gary was chief of staff for Mayor Daley and president of Chicago Public Schools. Carolyn's known him a long time too. And I neglected to mention, you hosted also One Flight Up on WBEZ. So for people who don't know, that's National Public Radio's affiliate in Chicago. That's another thing we have in common. We've kind of moved from journalism to politics, and sometimes even back to opinion journalism or whatever. So go on, continue. That's really interesting.
Well, I'm just saying, it was such a different time, Michael. The one thing it has in common with today is actually the shocking level of crime that occurred in the early 1990s under Mayor Daley, and really didn't abate. It tapered off, and then now again it's just kind of appalling. I mean, this past weekend, I believe 100 people were shot and a 3-year-old child was killed. So when we talk about defunding the police, it's a very different conversation in Minneapolis, where 30 people, I think, roughly have been killed this year, to here in Chicago, where we just haven't been able to get a handle on this. And I'm not saying we shouldn't reprioritize funding in any way. It's just that the mayor pointed out recently that when you talk about defunding, 70% of the police department budget is payroll. And if you go by the union contract, which you have to right now, the most recent people hired will be the most recent people let go, and they tend to be younger and more diverse. So these are complex issues, but it shouldn't be a matter of either or either. You know, you can reprioritize funding at the police department, and you can do what this mayor has already tried to do, which is put the social services where they're needed most and bring equity to the distribution of city services that have long been neglected on the south and west sides.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought. I'm glad we're in this area, and this actually will take a bit, and it's because it's in two buckets, but they're closely related. So, 102 people shot over the weekend in Chicago. Right, a 3-year-old was the youngest. 14 died, and I'll tell you something. Yesterday, somebody sent me an article from Chicago, or I came across it, where it was, so far, middle of the afternoon, so, in the morning or something, so far, 63 have been shot, and 6 have died. And I mean, in the next 12 hours, we got to 102 shot and 4. I mean, and this is not, if you're in Chicago, this is not new. And especially for you and I, who, we've been involved either integrally or peripherally supporting organizations to try to take on violence, especially in the west and south sides of Chicago. That's where it is. It's in 10 to 12 neighborhoods. They used to be called ceasefire zones, and but the neighborhoods are the same. A lot of shooting in Austin over the weekend. A lot you hear that. So before we go into the police accountability part, and it's related, but talk about why you think this has not abated in a real way over the last 10, 15 years, because there have been a lot of efforts, and sometimes it ebbs and flows. It goes down a little bit. Sometimes people say it moves from one community, it pushes off a little bit, but there are heroic people that have been on this program and that I have written about and worked with. Heroic people every day trying to change culture and give young people on the west and south sides jobs and dignity, and not a second chance, a first chance at a life free of the kinds of things where they're in that kind of danger. So, it's an impossibly broad question, but as you've watched it and worked with some of these groups, tell me about getting to the heart of that and making real change in terms of violence, and especially gun violence.
Well, I wish I had that magic answer, Michael. Yeah. I can tell you what one of our current clients, Victor Dixon, who's head of the Safer Foundation, which works with returning citizens. He's written, and we've talked about this recently, and one of the things he has said is, if your schools are not good and your community is lacking in basic services, or even grocery stores, for example, if you constantly have to travel out of your community in order to get the basic things. And by the way, we have this poverty tax so that you can pretty much guarantee that if you're living in these isolated and segregated communities, you will get poorer quality goods for a higher price. Yep. Than those of us who have access to these things. And it really, Michael, it all comes down to segregation. It is the fatal flaw of our city that we have never, ever been able to successfully and fully integrate as a city. I was in New York a lot recently when my daughter was living there, and it was remarkable because you would stand on a subway platform and look across, and you would see this diverse group of people, just incredibly diverse. Everybody was there. And then you stand on the L I take the red line sometimes, or I used to. I take the red line and you look across the platform and you can tell which direction people are heading based on the color makeup of the people standing across the platform. And that, until we figure that piece out, it's just too easy to allow these you can't lift up neighborhoods by force of will, or even with these kind of investments and interventions only. You have to give people opportunities that exist all over the city and in the better areas of the city, bottom line. And that people have to understand that. And I hope that the activism that we're seeing and the demonstrations that we're seeing here, it's heartening to me that they're occurring all over the city.
Right.
Because hopefully people get these connections. It's not just about the police department by any means. And we have to be willing as a city to do this work and to open up all our communities and lift everybody up by providing the services everywhere, because people live everywhere. And I think ultimately that's the puzzle that has to be put together.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that you brought up the segregation. This segregation is it's a brutal concept. It's a brutal word, and no one likes applying that to their home city. But I'll tell you something. A year ago, when the mayoral race was going on, and Lori and Gary and several of those others, I'd written remarks for Gary for the MLK breakfast, right? All the politicians were there. And I started myself, I wanted to write an article myself a couple months later. And I started learning more and more about Chicago's history and how the Dan Ryan separated those neighborhoods when the Richard J. Daley, right? Where he put the Dan Ryan, and also the history of redlining and the Black Belt on the South Side. And I mean, it was, Natalie Moore, she's written a whole book called The South Side. It's, because she grew up in Chatham and a white flight. And and it goes to what the country's dealing with right now. This is structural. This goes back so long. It is so holistic. It is not, police can't solve, I've said it, they can't solve this problem. They can't solve all that violence, even if they were operating at 110% perfection. It's just, and that's it. So let's go into Mayor Lightfoot. Now, obviously, you're a little bit biased because you're a supporter and you won with her and you advise her. And so you're not going to give me scathing criticism, of course, and I'm not asking for it. But look, I personally think that Lori Lightfoot has about, her heart is in about as much the right place it can be for any politician that's gotten to that height. And this is her first elected position. It's extraordinary. I have no questions about her motivation in terms of sincerity and what she wants to do with the power of the mayor of Chicago's office. That is not so for everybody, certainly in Chicago's history. But take me through, because you're on that inside from time to time, how some of the things she's tried to do already in a year, before all of this, nationally public violence that's drawn all this attention, but some of the things that she's done in terms of investment, and some of the things that you and she have found even more challenging than you thought before you got onto the 5th floor in 2020.
Well, I think that the mayor was so successful in part because she wasn't a politician, because she saw what was happening. She was not a fan of the previous mayor and the way he was approaching things. And really, I don't think it's talking out of school to say that the Police Accountability Task Force really was the pivotal point for her. Mayor Lightfoot had been the head of the police board. She had worked in city government before, but she was an attorney at Mayor Brown, and a very successful one. Being head of the police board was tough enough. That's never an easy position. And, after the Laquan McDonald shooting, Mayor Emanuel established a police accountability task force and asked her to chair it. As I wrote in a blog recently, the rest is history.
Yeah.
Because I believe that the mayor was approaching it as many mayors before him had, a task force that would tidy things up, make some recommendations, and allow him to move on from the Laquan McDonald shooting. And that was not Mayor Lightfoot's vision of how this should go. And she even expanded the task force. she appointed other people to it, but one of the first things she said is we have to go to these communities and we have to hold public hearings. And that, really unleashed it. Michael, I thought I had seen some things. I thought I knew how the city worked in, a pretty deep level, given my journalism career and having worked in government. But those hearings were remarkable. They were remarkable for so many reasons, but the stories were so consistent. People just poured their hearts out about their experiences, and some of them were just searing. And one that was really moving to me was actually at the last meeting, which was in Rogers Park. And this young white woman testified, and she said, I'm a waitress, and I work at a restaurant where a lot of police officers come, and they say terrible things about people in this community that they're supposed to be serving. And I don't understand why they feel they can say these things in front of me. Is it because I'm white too? But I don't understand how you can protect and serve a community that you have this dislike for. And these questions remain unanswered. And this is not an indictment of every police officer, obviously. It remains to be said that these are tough jobs that people, for the most part, every day get up and do right now on 12-hour shifts. It's not easy. At the same time, that basic, that systemic problem has to be dealt with. But in any event, that task force was, I think, for the mayor, the point at which the seed began to be planted that we just need to move in a different direction. This is all not going the right way. We have to have more equity. We have to have this city service everywhere and reinvest in these communities in a way that hasn't happened in the past. So, here we are, but it's a struggle. One of the things she wanted to do is take away aldermanic privilege, where aldermen in Chicago have the ability to say, no, you're not going to build that in my community.
Right.
And that remains a real point of contention. Aldermen view it as an important part of their aldermanic power, but it's very hard to say where low-income housing is going to be built if certain aldermen are just willing to, say no to, and I've been in a lot of these battles, Michael, on zoning, whether it's for a treatment facility in the community, whether it's for even low-income senior housing. I mean, it's kind of pathetic at this point in time that people have objections to that.
It's unbelievable. And this was a big issue in the campaign, and more than one candidate was, including Gary, I think it was all of a sudden fashionable to, you can't beat them, join them, that get rid of aldermanic privilege. And it goes so much deeper than that. Back to police accountability for a minute, and Mayor Lightfoot, when she was on that board, you were involved both on that police accountability, if I'm not mistaken, the task force, and also working with, at the time, Lisa Madigan, the Illinois Attorney General, and that ties into the federal government with that whole consent decree. I want to read you something. This is a quote from Attorney General Madigan from July 27, 2018. So this is 2 years ago. Go back 2 years before what we've seen over the last couple of months nationally in all these cities. Quote, for decades, efforts to reform the Chicago Police Department have failed, resulting in a profound lack of trust between the police and the communities they serve. The consent decree will mandate reforms to ensure constitutional policing and, ultimately, make Chicago safer for residents and police officers. Now, I'm not reading that because it's any great shakes or anything surprising, but the point is, that's something that you could see on press statements today in some of these cities. It's a little bolder now because of the protests in the streets, and it has a sharper edge. Thank goodness. This stuff moves too incrementally. But in your experience, working with those police accountability task forces and building that consent decree, this all came from, just so folks remember, Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times in Chicago. There's a film called 16 Shots I just saw, and about how much the mayor's office knew, Rahm Emanuel then, and about suppressing the tape until Jamie Calvin, this one amazing journalist, got it out of there and got it in front of people's eyes. But talk about why this is so damn hard. Police accountability, keeping police accountable while at the same time keeping them in a place where they're motivated and believe in their jobs and think that they're being appreciated. It's very, right now, it's not, you can get into a dangerous area right now saying, well, on the one hand and the other, or bad apples, right? I don't like that term too, but I'm just saying it's very sensitive right now. But what you said is true, that there are good cops, and a lot of them, I know them, and they try their hardest, and it's a job that not many other people would choose. So how do you balance those things? And especially going back to the time when you were right in the thick of it in Chicago.
Well, I don't want to overstate my role. It was communications in both of those issues. It was providing, the community outreach, as well as websites and some media support, not subject matter expertise. But I learned a lot in the process. And one of the things I learned, Michael, is that, it's the union contract. A lot of the problems are encapsulated in the police union contract. And I'll give you just one example off the top of my head, which is that seniority allows officers to begin to choose where they go and what shifts that they work. And the result of that is that newer police officers on the street might get thrown into Inglewood on the night shift.
Right.
How does that make any sense? So they only see these communities at night. They don't get a flavor for the organizations, the people that get up and go to work every day, the parents that get up and walk their kids to school every day. They're not getting that, and they're
nor the experience.
Nor the experience, nor in some cases they were trained by cops who were put on desk duty. So these things tend to perpetuate. And so when people are calling for changes in legislation, state legislation, for example, part of it is, overriding what's in those contracts. One thing was just upheld in the past. Any record on a police officer, complaints, etc., were to be destroyed after 5 years. Well, that was recently struck down, but that was part of the contract as well. And why is the contract so screwed up? In part because, staffing police is expensive, and as mayors began to negotiate, the police officers' union representatives gave up some money in exchange for these kind of perceived protections of officers. Things like they get to view the video of what happened before they give a statement. Right. You and I don't have that right,
no,
right?
No, not at all.
So,
that was part of 16 Shots. That was part of the documentary about how the police could get together and talk before the statements,
Yeah, right. So we see the problems. And again, I didn't really tie that back up, but when the mayor saw how things were working at that granular level, and she didn't really see any hope for change with things going forward the way they were. So now she's in the position of trying to balance all of that with, again, these crime numbers that, you asked earlier why it goes up, it goes down. I do believe our segregated city has a lot to do with that. There's a lot of reasons for it, and that has to be the toughest thing on her plate right now, is figuring out how to lower these crime rates while at the same time dealing with these issues of accountability, and they do go hand in hand. There's absolutely no question that there's no trust there, no question whatsoever.
Yeah, and the other, and what's a shame, even makes me, that I read that quote from 2 years ago, and that this consent decree, and it was going to be put in place, I think, right after the mayoral election. That was part of it, and to think that a year later, it's like we didn't even get a chance with all the distrust that we're seeing now that's being engendered from all of these events and everybody watching it, and the division between law enforcement and the third thing that makes it even harder for Mayor Lightfoot or any incoming mayor is that Chicago's and Illinois is not awash in money. They're in debt. It's the worst in the country worst state in the country, I believe, fiscally, Illinois. And Chicago, it's just, that's how it is in a big city. You don't have a surplus. The schools and the city budget are very tight and difficult to manage. So that investment that we talked about that you'd want to see, even to cut into the historic segregation in our city, that's hard enough. And I think that the mayor has tried to make some of those investments, but it's not like you can go on a spending spree, even if that were going to correct the problem. Okay, it's total non sequitur because I don't want to take too much of your time, but I would be lax if I did not ask you a couple of questions about your career in business and some of the lessons that you've learned. And I think that this is a great question, especially for women who want to start businesses. More and more have been started since you started in '95, but back then, just like most breakthrough and trailblazers, it's harder to do it the earlier you do it. Now, I mean, you're not the first woman CEO in 1995, but especially in the PR space, you're one of the first to launch your own firm, take your knowledge from politics and PR, and start a company. And you're in year 25 with multiple employees. You do marketing and communications, not just a lot of nonprofits, but also corporations and companies. So you have a broad portfolio. Tell me what it was like then starting that business and building it, and then we'll talk maybe about a lesson or two along the way that you learned that anybody could apply these days.
Well, I have to reject the trailblazer portion of what you say. I mean, you could apply that to maybe Janet Dietrich's, our mutual friend who was one of the first female publicists back in the day in Chicago, who is now, shall we say, I don't think she'd mind if I said she's over 90. So, there were many, fortunately I had women, certainly in the PR space, who were very good about sharing what they had learned.
Well, I have to interrupt Carolyn here. You also were a trailblazer in terms of managing the re-election of Mayor Richard M. Daley in Chicago. I've been in politics, there were not a lot of female campaign managers of big races like that 25 years ago. So that was unique too. So I'm giving you credit whether you're taking it or not. But again, take me back to when you started the company, and then those lessons that, like any business owner, you learn pretty quick.
Yeah. I was kind of I had more balls than brains, at the time. So it didn't seem that difficult to me. It just seemed like the next logical step after a career in journalism. And then I had ultimately spent 5 years in government and thought, okay, I know what to do now. So it was really kind of a little bit of luck, a lot of luck actually. But I do feel like I've learned to be a good manager, and it's really tough to be one right now when everyone is working remotely.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that, as you know, Michael, we have a very flat management style. Not only is my door always open, I don't actually have a door.
Right. The layout on Carolyn's floor. Like I said, I partnered with Carolyn, and so she's been kind enough to welcome me back to Chicago when I started my business a couple years ago. And it's this beautifully designed. It feels like it's Google or something in Chicago. And I think, didn't you have someone who had designed some of that spaces out there that did that work for you? It's a really cool office.
Nick Pizzetti did our internal design. And if you do look at the Google space, you can see little touches. Theirs is obviously a lot more extra,
a little bigger,
a lot more extra than ours. So yeah, we have offices. We have some offices, but they don't have doors. But the point there being, you know, everybody is heard. Everybody is welcome and encouraged to talk about the direction of the agency and where we're going and why we're going there. And so we've always had, you know, we've always had a lot of heart as an organization. And one thing I tell young women who are thinking about this is get good clients that can produce revenue, but don't do it at the expense. Understand what your values are going in, and don't do it at the expense of working against your own value system. That's not, you know, necessarily something they would tell you in business school. And a lot of my business owner friends don't even agree with that, especially lobbyists. But
of course, but that's become also, that's become your brand. It's an integrity thing, and it's what you stand for, and that word gets around about that, right? Yeah.
I mean, I just felt in the very beginning, you know, there were certain things we weren't going to do. We weren't going to work for anti-choice organizations. We weren't going to work. We weren't going to do anything with guns. We weren't going to do anything with tobacco, which was easy back then when we were just a couple people and nobody was knocking our door down. But every single one of those things has come up multiple times over the years, and you know, we've never wavered on that. To me, if you're going to own your own business, part of the fun is doing what you want to do and not working with people that you don't want to work with for whatever reason. So yeah, we're a little bit picky. And yes, now it is, I guess, part of our brand. It's important to know where you stand. It's important to have values as an organization, and values that the people that you work for are drawn to and feel like that's what they want to be a part of. You know, which is not to say we're only working with nonprofit organizations. We have a good mix of nonprofit, some government, and a lot of business and corporate clients. It's worked well for us over these years. But yeah, it is challenging right now. Zoom, we love you as a tool, but it doesn't make up for those face-to-face, those interactions. I honestly have said, it's like we're doing all the work, probably more productive than ever, but we're not having as much fun, not nearly as much fun.
That's, you're right, and that's capitalism in general. But this has really put a fine point on it. You know, the efficiency with which we're doing this, and I mean, look, if companies never had to pay rent again, that alone, that's money. But yes, I'm like you. I can do most of my stuff, and I do on email and phone, and I'm still out in Arizona. And if I came back, I wouldn't be having that many face-to-face meetings. That's part of my consideration. By the way, Carolyn, what you said, just for younger folks in particular, I sound so old, but it's true. You described the balls and brains thing. What you're saying is, there's a great lesson in there, is that you had guts and you just were going to do it. And I found that to be the same thing, whether in politics or nonprofit or journalism and television. You know, things are scary when you don't know what you're doing, but that's also part of the fun. And there are things in life, most things, that you got to learn by doing. You can read all the textbooks you want, but you got to go and do it and make your mistakes, right? And that's, by the way, the irony is the balls, brains. That's how you get the brains or the smarts or the expertise, if you will. And that's what you've done. And I think that your team, I think that they really learned that from you. I know. I watch from the background, even though I'm not technically part of that team, but I've gotten to know a lot of them. Okay, one last question. Since we're on the part about your company and public relations and public affairs, this is a broad question too, but answer it any way you want, narrow it down. In 1995, there was no internet. There certainly wasn't social media. There wasn't any of this stuff. And that's when I was doing television. I was in Iowa at the time. There was none of this. We were shooting on 3/4-inch tapes in our cameras. And now the world has changed so much. You've not only sustained your business through all of those changes, you've grown it. And in fact, I referred you to somebody who's doing a virtual town hall, and you were talking about storytelling in the digital age with Kevin Houseworth. Um, what what have you had to do to really adapt your storytelling, your marketing and communications? What's the secret to still being really good at that? I mean, obviously it's like you say in your site, it's framing and reframing narratives. But how did you make that sort of crossover and continue to build your business? I think that's interesting.
The sad answer to some of that, Michael, is that we wouldn't be able to survive now without social media on behalf of our clients because of the contraction of traditional journalism.
Wow.
I mean, okay, to go way back in the beginning, one of the things I do is I'm on the Chicago Committee of Human Rights Watch. And back in the day, when researchers came through Chicago to talk about what was going on in Korea or China or anywhere, we would easily set them up with a Tribune editorial board or meetings with Tribune reporters and get stories out of it.
Right.
Well, when's the last time the Chicago Tribune covered any international news? At the time, they had bureaus. They had bureaus in other places in the world. I mean, that's just sort of an extreme example, because now, I mean, they're just losing reporters left and right. And it's more challenging. It's more challenging to tell great stories. Victor, for example, we finally got an op-ed or a letter to the editor in the Sun-Times last week where he talks about the fact that we don't pay prisoners. More than 5 states don't pay prisoners at all. Many states pay them pennies on the dollar, and they're working. How are they supposed to build up an opportunity to go back into the world without any money to their name when they walk out of prison with the best of intentions? And not only that, isn't this exploitation? What are we thinking? So that's just one example of a really provocative story that ended up in a letter to the editor, which in the past we should have been able to place. But right now, in particular, with the contraction of journalism and with everybody all COVID and all police reform all the time, it's really challenging. So social media for us is an opportunity. It's just an opportunity to tell those stories in a different way to different audiences, and to audiences that are tuned into your issues. That's the other thing. Sometimes clients would say, we've got to get this in whatever, in the Wall Street Journal, or in the Chicago Tribune. And then sometimes you would ask, well, how many people are going to read it? What if the story's on page 17? In some ways, social media is much more effective because you can talk to the people who care about the things that you have to say, and you can find them. So it's been, of course, it's a double-edged sword, but it's a real opportunity. I just, as a former journalist and as a PR professional, I hate to see this. And we do everything that we can to support WBEZ, WTTW, The Reporter, Block Club, every local media outlet. And who would think the Sun-Times would still be going strong today? We're still a 2-newspaper town in Chicago, albeit marginally, but we have to do everything that we can to support real journalism.
Yeah, you and I think once a journalist, straight journalist, always a journalist, in some ways, right? You can't go back to straight journalism once you've been an opinion journalist or been in politics. That gets a little blurred. There are, exceptions like George Stephanopoulos, but it's not usual. But you still, I know you and I feel the same way, how important pure straight journalism is. And there's just, the resources are shrinking. Our friend Rick Pearson was furloughed recently from the Tribune. I mean, he is, talk about institutional memory in Chicago of politics, 30 years. I mean, when you're furloughing someone like him, you're getting close to the bone there, but I appreciate that answer. I think that it's really interesting. You and I could have taken any one of these subjects and talked for an hour and a half about them, and I find that is in every one of these conversations. That's why they're so much fun. But we'll do this again down the line and spend some more time. But I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, Carolyn. And I want to publicly thank you for your generosity to me the last 2 years since I came back to Chicago, started a business, and started doing all those other things that I love about our city. Carolyn introduced me, believe it or not, to the architectural boat tour in Chicago. I'd never gone on it in my whole life. I was the only person left in the city of Chicago. And now I go on it probably once a month, or I did until this whole fiasco started. But I digress. Thank you, my friend, for everything and for, as I expected, a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.